Citizen watches have never been my favourite. Just 3 years ago, when I did my full review of the brand, I found they were well constructed with exciting technologies and extensive history at reasonable prices. I could see why they'd accrued a sizable fanbase. Nevertheless, I also found some big downsides, including mismatched bracelets with inadequate adjustment systems, awkward lug widths which restricted strap options, minor QC issues, and a penchant for exclusively large sizing. It was rare to see a watch under 41mm. Perhaps the biggest hurdle though was the styling. I know it's each to their own, but 99% of the Citizen catalogue sent me to sleep quicker than a vat of wine followed by a right hook from Mike Tyson. Fast forward to today, and I've bought 3 of them. Yes, 3 Citizen watches, and that's because nowadays, Citizens fit. They've had a string of hits, including some good-looking new Pro Masters, the quirky bullhead reissues, and then the highly popular Tsuyosa models. What really set the tone though was the sub-seconds version of the Tsuyosa, which came soon after with a beautiful concentric dial texture that made it look even better. At that point I was like, okay Citizen, now you have my attention. The Tsuyosa, it still doesn't fit me, but I like where you're going with this. What's next? Then this popped up on my feed, and again, and again, and again. It's the new Forza Automatic, also named the Zenshin in some regions, and seemingly every watch Instagrammer and YouTuber has covered this in some form or another. Undoubtedly, this is the most hyped Citizen I've ever seen. I've seen it called a luxury watch killer, a cheaper Grand Seiko, and basically just the best value watch ever made. And while you could chalk this up solely to clickbait, at a glance, such comparisons somehow seem plausible for once. You see, the Forza seem to have another god-tier dial for a budget watch. What's more, unlike the Tsuyosa, this watch wasn't made of stainless steel. Instead, it shipped with a far more advanced Super Titanium case. I had to take a look at it. So I headed online to buy it, and I was a little stopped in my tracks. You see, when I searched for Citizen Forza, I was also met with 2 other watches that no one seemed to have covered, a regular 3-hander and a chronograph, both of which shared the same elaborate dial texture, but were instead powered by Citizen's famous Eco Drive solar technology. I couldn't help but feel curious. I lobbed those in the cart too. After all, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss something, and I'm glad I did, because I actually would have missed something. Something I think most reviewers have missed, actually a couple of things. Either way, I'll run you through each of them, the pros and cons, how they compare, and I'll even scratch one of them to see if the Super Titanium coating is as good as they claim. That's called foreshadowing, folks. I've got something extremely exciting to share with you first. It's a special project that I've kind of been working on behind the scenes to address a pet peeve that I've got with the watch industry. It's called In the Loop, and the problem is all too familiar. The watch news outlets only tend to cover super expensive luxury watches. You never hear about the more affordable stuff, the stuff that you and I can actually afford without getting beheaded by our partners. More and more, great watches are just slipping completely under the radar because it's not as profitable to cover them. So nobody knows they even exist. And that's where In the Loop comes in. Each week I trawl through all the notable watch brands' websites, identify all the new releases from these brands, and cherry pick the best and most interesting models. Every Thursday, I then email them to you in a fun, bite-sized format, along with my thoughts on each new release, together with a bunch of extra goodies just thrown in there. For the last 3 issues, we've been the only outlet on the planet covering some of these watches. So if you want the latest affordable watch news in one quick, convenient location, you should sign up for free to In the Loop. We've had some really fantastic feedback on it already, so I'm really pleased to announce it publicly, and thanks for all the kind messages too. Head to the link in the description and sign up if you want to stay in the loop. I'll see you on Thursday. Okay, of course, we're going to start off with the big hitter. This is the Forza Automatic, or Zenshin Automatic. The code name for this particular color is the NJ080-80M. It's the light blue version, which seems to be the most popular from what I've seen online. It typically retails for a shade under 500 quid or $500 US, but it can be had for a chunk less from grey market sites. I'll affiliate link it as well as the other 2 in the video description in case you want to check it out. Up close, you'll see that the texture looks pretty much as good as it does in the product photos, and does look akin to a bunch of much more expensive textured dial watches. It's not as 3-dimensional as some other dials I've covered before, such as the San Martin desert dial watches, but the shallow ridges and bumps still provide a pretty magical effect that transforms as you move the watch around. When you look at it up close, it becomes even more remarkable. How did Citizen make something that seems so complex for a watch at this price? I remember saying the same about the Tsuyosa Small Seconds too, which was even cheaper. At this point, it seems like Citizen is seizing the crown from Seiko as the king of lower cost watch dials, among the big boys at least, especially given the ballooning cost of newer Seiko releases. It looks premium, the printing of the text is serviceable, and the markers and hands are relatively clean screen too. Surrounding this inner area is a set of engraved rings that form the minute track. Some of the other variants use this section to add a second colour, which I think is an improvement over the single-tone blue version here. Perhaps it's the illusion of a smaller dial size or the dark eyeliner effect that frames everything up properly. I can't be sure. I just know that I lean more towards those two-tone versions. That said, Citizen has done a great job choosing these colours overall, which each brings something different to the table. While it's hard to criticise the dial really, if I had to be picky, I do think it looks a little cluttered and bottom-heavy given the imbalanced placement of the subdial and lower text. As far as automatics go, in the flesh, I think the more symmetrical Seiko small seconds is the better looking of the two, though it is a close contest no doubt. Despite the material differences, the case shape is also quite similar, albeit the new Forza has an even more angular appearance than the Seiko, with squared off sides and a more standard 3 o'clock crown. The level of finishing on the case is good for a titanium watch at this price, and is more than adequate not to cheapen the watch's appearance. Though the polishing, I wouldn't say is quite on par with offerings from the Casio Oceanus series and Swiss Watch Company. Like some of the Casio Oceanus models, you'll notice that this Citizen has fixed integrated end links, which slot nicely into the bracelet, but simultaneously will heavily limit your strap choices. Unfortunately, just like with the earlier titanium Citizens, the bracelet isn't a perfect match to the case. It has a blasted matte finish all over, which works nicely with the flanks of the watch, but doesn't follow on from the vertically brushed upper sections of the watch whatsoever. It just stops as soon as you hit the bracelet. The overall tone of the metal is the same, so this deficiency isn't nearly as obvious as with the previous titanium Citizen I looked at, but I'm surprised more reviewers aren't mentioning this, as you will notice it after a while. The bracelet links themselves are fine. They're all titanium, so they're nice and lightweight, just like the watch, though I'm unsure if they're the same material as the case itself. I guess we'll test that later. They also have the same polished lip as the lugs on the main housing, which is nice to see, though they're a little neutered by the underwhelming clasp system. It may be a titanium clasp, which is great, but it's stamped, thin, and only gives you 2 micro adjustment holes to pick from. Superior clasps are available elsewhere, that's for sure. Personally, I have struggled to get the ideal fit with these, which is doubly a shame given that it's hard to change the strap. The same can be said of the movement. Inside is the Miyota 8213, an automatic movement near identical to those found in many far lower cost watches. The only difference here is that the 8213 enables the small seconds complication, whereas the comparable 8210 movement doesn't. The Miyota 8000 series isn't exactly great. They have noisy rotors, a low beat rate, which essentially means the second hand isn't as smooth as some other movements, and they also look very plain, even versions with this gold finish. It's got a decent advertised accuracy of plus/minus 20 seconds a day, but overall it's nothing to write home about. Thankfully, water resistance is good at 10 bar, so the movement likely won't be getting wet anytime soon. And as for scratches, well, it does have a piece of sapphire atop, which is the best crystal type when it comes to scratch resistance. Overall, it's definitely the optimal choice for this watch, and it looks good on the spec sheet for sure. But it also has a con that, yet again, reviewers seem to be skimming over with this one. Like some lower-end Casios, this Citizen Sapphire is far from the clearest I've come across. It's got a noticeable cloudiness to it, which does hamper the visibility and punchiness of the dial at a range of angles. It's also subpar at dealing with reflections, which is a real shame given the swanky surface that sits beneath. I mean, why would you want to hide that surface? It looks awesome. Citizen also cut costs in the loom department, which again, it's just being overlooked. I know loom isn't everything, but look at this. It's so poor, it might as well not exist. Again, here's proof that a good spec sheet doesn't always carry over to real life. As for the fit, it's okay. In many ways, it falls victim to the same challenge as other integrated bracelet watches. It's got a bolt straight profile, as you can see here, meaning that you're all but guaranteed to have those gaps under the lugs, especially if you've got small wrists like me. The Citizen website says this watch is 41mm, but I measured it up as about 40.5, with a 47.3mm lug to lug and an 11.5mm thickness. I've always preferred more conforming curved case shapes, but I have to say the baked in lug design isn't as much of a problem as I anticipated, as the bracelet can tilt downwards at a steeper angle than the rival Tissot PRX. And on that subject, I do just generally prefer this watch in most regards, at least to the Quartz PRX, which is the most comparably priced one. Personally, I think it's still a little too large for most people. I've seen a huge range of wrist shots from buyers and reviewers, and in most instances, I just get the gut feeling that the watch looks a bit too big. Unfortunately, it's the same fate shared by the CA4610-85Z, also known as the Zenshin Chrono, or the Forza Chrono. What gives with that naming? Indeed, this one looks even better in the online images, with styling somewhat akin to the Tissot PRX chronograph, but with a different movement, case material, and price tag. The 3 colors this one ships in all have the trendy high contrast setup with dark subdials and that overall lighter dial dial tone. The sad part is, it's 42mm. In fact, my calipers had this at 42.5, which will inherently be hugely restrictive. At present, there's no smaller version of this one available, meaning unless you're a bodybuilder or competitive eater, or specifically just want a big watch for your arm, the Chrono likely won't fit on your shopping list even. It's a shame too, as it somehow implements the same dial texture as the automatic version, despite running off solar power. Indeed, hiding beneath this dial, or potentially in those translucent subdials, are solar receptive cells that turn light into battery power. Eco Drive has been a great innovation since it was introduced decades ago, but now Citizen seems to have mastered the way they implement this tech to the extent where it no longer affects the visuals whatsoever. On that topic, there's something I need to point out with this model in particular. On the website, it's listed as salmon, yet the product images almost give the impression that this watch is more of a golden brown tone. In person though, the hue is substantially different. Oddly, it's much more accurate to its namesake, an orange pink that is much more akin to a real salmon fillet. I have to say though, I just don't really like it in person. It's not awful, but it doesn't combine with the darker accents like the subdials and chapter ring nearly as well as the creamer appearance shown in the product shots. Absolutely, I'd say the white dial is going to be the best of the three, avoiding the colour clashes that mar the others. This one does have other redeeming qualities. The hands and markers are again clean and neat. The subdials are deeply set with reflective chamfers to highlight each of them. The sweep of this chronograph hand is also a nice to have, considering this is usually only a trait of mechanical or mecha quartz timepieces. Unfortunately, the Chrono is even bulkier than the Auto. It's a shade under 12mm thick, but in every other aspect it's virtually identical. Same water resistance, bracelet, crystal, and the same case style as the Automatic. So yeah, it's a good option if you want a big white chronograph watch, but what if you don't? What if you want something less niche? Well, that's where we get to the final contender, the overlooked one, the three-hander. This one is the AW013085X. I've also now seen people referring to this one as Citizen Core? What the fuck's going on with the naming? Either way, this is the one I'm most excited about for some fairly obvious reasons. Primarily, it's the size. This is the smallest of the set, with a 39.5mm width and only a 10mm thickness. The lug to lug is also just 46.3mm, including the baked-in end links. It's not exactly small, but I do think it's way better proportioned than the other two. And the Eco Drive movement is also far lighter than the Automatic, giving you a truly featherweight final result. This thing vanishes on wrist, you will forget you've got it on. It's also less cluttered than the Automatic, with a sleeker, more symmetrical dial that's only interrupted by the oversized day-date window. Let's be real, that bit, it could have been slashed down or cut completely. Regardless, I think it's the best looking of the three and probably the one to get for most people. It's also $100 less than the Automatic, as well as the most practical given all the solar stuff. Obviously, price is subject to change. My main question is this one running off magic? I mean, the dial here looks exactly the same as the Automatic one, and it doesn't even have the panel-like subdials from the chronograph. So how exactly is such a detailed dial like this taking in light and then charging up a battery? It's truly extraordinary stuff. Remember when solar watches used to look like this? Man, how things have changed. The pattern seems to be the same on each unit, as this model's dial imperfections match those in the stock images, so yours should look just like this if you get one. This green version in particular is a sweetie. Of course, this model shares the same basic pros and cons as the other two, and despite the more compact dimensions, it still retains some of that under lug space, meaning it can still slide around a bit. It's also the most vanilla of the three, I'd say, especially combined with the standard looking markers and hands that are used across the range. And that only leaves us with the headline feature, the one that Citizen likes to ram down your throat in virtually every marketing email: Super Titanium! Now, we've had some trouble with this material in the past, or should I say Citizen's way of marketing it. On their website, they like to yell about how Super Titanium is 40% lighter and 5 times harder than stainless steel. Yet in our Mohs hardness scratch test video that we did a while back, we found it didn't perform 5 times better than steel. In fact, it didn't perform better full stop. If anything, it was marginally worse. The Super Titanium branded watch we scratched, advertised as such by Citizen on their own site, scratched just like a completely untreated titanium Loris watch that was a fraction of the price. As a result, I assumed that Super Titanium was yet another bogus marketing invention to ramp up prices. Nevertheless, multiple commenters disagreed. They said there were different versions of Super Titanium available with differing levels of performance, and that my watch was just bottom tier. The thing is, as an English speaker, you'd never know this when buying. All Super Titanium watches on non-Japanese sites are just listed as Super Titanium across the board. If these coating tiers do exist, you can't tell on the spec sheet. And Citizen's documentation about this material? Well, it's basically non-existent. The English Super Titanium information page makes no mention of any different performance tiers. Indeed, it turns out you have to head to the Japanese version of their website, navigate to this specific page, and then translate everything as you scroll with a tool like Google Lens to learn about these covert differences. There's no official equivalent of this detailed page outside of Japan. No documentation even ships with the watches. Now, some Citizens do have terminology on the case rear, so if you're already in the know about this, it could help a bit. But if you're not, like 99.9% of us, you'd have no clue. And it's not like this web page is easy to find either. I couldn't find any easy route to it on the Citizen Japan site, and I only hunted it down after specifically searching for it in Google. The Citizen watch we previously scratched just said base titanium on the back, which, according to commenters, meant it was bottom tier or had no coating at all and barely qualified as super titanium despite being advertised as that. Apparently, I explicitly needed to look for the word Duratect, which is the fancy name for the high-end treatment or coating. Well, these Forza watches do say Duratect on the back. I mean, it doesn't say which version of Duratect this is. This Japanese webpage lists multiple different methods and up to 10 different types of this Duratect treatment, none of which are simply called Duratect, at least according to that page. I'm assuming it's the titanium carbide version, given the watch is titanium and it's been used on other similarly priced ranges before, but I can't be sure. It then gets even more bizarre, because with some leeway for mistranslation, it says at the top of the page, titanium with Duratect is super titanium. Well, the last watch I bought was titanium and was marketed as super titanium by Citizen. So that means that must have been Duratect too, right? Even though it lacked the branding on the case back. So how do these new Duratect watches actually fare then? Well, it turns out exactly the same as last time. My Mohs scratch kit gave marks at level 4, light to medium scratches at level 5, and deep scratches at level 6. I took on feedback from the last test video and used a slightly better technique this time, but I still got identical results. I got the same score on both the bracelet and the main housing, by the way. For context, this is slightly worse performance than 304, 316L, and 904L steel, the three main steel types used in watchmaking. It's also comparable to that same untreated Loris titanium watch as well. So in this instance, the Duratect wording doesn't seem to make a shred of difference. This whole mess got me thinking, is this even legal? To lead with such umbrella claims about the hardness and scratch resistance, when many of the products sold under this super titanium moniker don't come close to those performance claims. Well, I've looked at the ASA website, the advertising regulator here in the UK, as well as the government's legislation site, and I'd be surprised if Citizen weren't breaking multiple laws by omitting this key information and selling lower tier products under the same banner with identical performance claims. I'm not saying that they are breaking these laws, just that they could be, and if they were, they'd be pretty scummy. Nefarious or accidental, legal or not, this mess needs clearing up, especially because they just don't need to be doing this. They've got bangers. Bangers without all this misleading nonsense. Maybe the very highest end Duratect treatments do reach those heights, but if so, the hardness claim should be attached only to those models, not the full range. This is highly misleading. If you're just a regular buyer, or heck even a watch nerd, and you see these online claims, buy the watch, take it home, and find that its scratch is just the same as everything else, you're gonna be pissed. Because I know I am. Now, I wouldn't say these findings ruin the value of the Forza range or anything. They're still good watches with great dials, and they are reasonably priced. If the three-hander fitted me, I'd probably keep it. It's just that super titanium shouldn't automatically be seen as this god-tier flagship feature or put on such a pedestal by reviewers when most watches with this branding scratch just as badly as industry standard materials or even just plain titanium. Super titanium does advertise some other niche advantages too, but I think scratches are the most common thing you'll likely run into. I'm not going to be leaving this thing underwater for months, am I? Citizen needs to be way more transparent with their tiering, naming, and marketing. Content creators should also stop automatically hyping up super titanium and taking the extreme marketing claims at face value without doing any basic testing, or even looking up tests like the ones we've done here. It turns out that super titanium usually isn't so super. At least other companies like Casio clearly tell you when their watches use titanium carbide without all this extra fuss or jargon, and micro brands like RZE just have one coating that works excellently across the board. In fact, you can check out the full scratch test, including that RZE, on screen now. The Citizen Forzas are also linked in the video description if you do want to check them out.